The concrete was still curing when the letter arrived. Dale Mercer was standing at the kitchen table, still wearing his work boots, when his wife set the envelope down without comment. The return address read, USDA Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service, Des Moines Field Office. Outside, the sound of the skid loader was running. His two sons, Kevin and Gary, were moving gravel for the drainage apron on the new addition. 400 square feet of freshly framed farrowing space bolted onto the south end of a barn that had stood since 1971. Dale set the envelope face down and walked back outside. He didn't open it that night. That was a mistake he would spend the next 8 months unraveling. It was the spring of 1984, and hog farming in Iowa was doing what it had been threatening to do for 3 years. It was breaking. The cash price for live hogs at the Sioux City terminal had fallen below $45 per hundredweight by April. Feed corn was running around $3 a bushel, which sounds reasonable until you account for the conversion ratio. Roughly 3 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of gain, stacked across a finishing cycle of 5 to 6 months per market hog. The math wasn't working. It hadn't been working for most producers since the late 1970s, when a combination of cheap credit, federal expansion incentives, and competitive pressure had pushed everyone in the Midwest to add stalls. When everyone adds stalls, the national herd grows. When the national herd grows faster than demand, prices fall. That's not economics as theory. That's what actually happened. Kevin was 29 that year. Gary was 26. Their father Dale had run a farrow-to-finish operation in Sac County since 1968, starting with a 120 sow herd and building it steadily through the 1970s. He'd survived the 1973 price swings. He'd come through 1979 with the operating line intact. He had a methodical approach, slow expansion, conservative debt, and a habit of keeping paper records going back to the first year. He was not a man who forgot things easily, except he had forgotten one thing, or not forgotten exactly, more like filed it away in a mental drawer that the boys had no idea existed. Kevin had brought the expansion idea to the table in October of 1983. His argument was straightforward. If the margin per head was compressing, you had to increase throughput to maintain income. The barn currently handled a 240 sow herd at any given cycle. At current prices and feed costs, they were losing somewhere between $4 and $8 per market hog, depending on the week. Kevin's position was that they could reach 340 sows, with the addition, spread fixed overhead across more animals, and reach a volume threshold where the losses became manageable until prices recovered. He'd run the numbers 3 or 4 times. The spreadsheet showed a path. Gary was less certain, but went along with it. He'd asked once, directly, "What if prices don't recover?" Kevin had said they always did. That was also true, historically. What Kevin didn't factor in, couldn't have factored in without knowing what his father knew, was that volume, in this case, had a ceiling. Not a metaphorical one, a legal one. The expansion broke ground in February of 1984. They financed it through an operating line extension at the First National Bank in Sac City, adding $62,000 to an existing note that was already sitting at $140,000. The loan officer, a man named Phil Draper, who had been doing agricultural lending since the mid-1960s, signed off on the extension after reviewing their projected output numbers. He had concerns, he said so, but he approved it. The bank had a significant portfolio in hog operations across 3 counties, and pulling credit at that moment would have accelerated exactly the kind of failures nobody wanted on the books. By late March, the framing was up. By late April, the concrete was poured. By June, the first sows were cycling into the expanded farrowing space. Back inside the house, the USDA letter was still sitting on the counter. Dale had read it by then. He hadn't told the boys what it said. What it said, in summary, was this: the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service was conducting a routine review of production quota certificates issued under the 1977 Hog Stabilization Program provisions. The Mercer operation held a certificate, number IA-0741-H, that established a baseline annual production quota of 42,000 hundredweight of live hog production, tied to a 3-year rolling average calculated from the 1975 through 1977 production period. That baseline, once registered, became the ceiling against which any federal support calculations or penalty assessments would be indexed. Producers who exceeded their quota ceiling could face per hundredweight assessments on the overage. The review was being triggered, the letter said, because the county office had received permit notifications for barn expansion projects, and the ASCS was cross-referencing those notifications against existing quota files. Dale had filed for that certificate in 1978. At the time, it was presented as a protective measure, a way to lock in a historical production baseline that could shield the farm from deeper penalty exposure if future federal supply control programs were enacted. What nobody clearly explained in 1978, or what Dale had not fully retained, was that the certificate also established the maximum authorized production level. It was a two-sided instrument. It provided protection below the line and created liability above it. The certificate put their authorized annual production at 42,000 hundredweight. Before the expansion, running the 240 sow herd at standard industry productivity, roughly 18 to 20 weaned pigs per sow per year, with a 93 to 95% live delivery rate to finish weight, they were producing somewhere around 38 to 40,000 hundredweight annually, right at the ceiling. Some years under, some years just at it. With the expansion to 340 sows at the same productivity rates, they were projecting to produce closer to 55,000 hundredweight, 13,000 hundredweight over the authorized quota baseline. At an assessed penalty rate that the 1977 provisions set at 50 cents per hundredweight over quota, a figure that had been adjusted upward by administrative rule to 75 cents by 1983. That was a potential penalty exposure of just under $10,000 per production year. $10,000. On an operation already losing $4 to $8 per market hog. Kevin found out in July. Dale called them both into the kitchen on a Tuesday evening after supper. He'd pulled the quota certificate folder out of the cabinet where it had been sitting since 1978. He laid it on the table next to the USDA letter. He didn't say much. He let them read. Gary read the letter first, then the certificate. He said, "What's the penalty rate?" Dale told him. Kevin sat back in his chair and stared at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you say something when we started planning this?" Dale's answer was honest. He said he hadn't thought the certificate was still active in a meaningful way. He said the program had seemed to fade after 1980, when the Reagan administration began signaling a shift away from supply management toward market-oriented policy. He said he thought the quota provisions had been administratively suspended. He was wrong. They hadn't been suspended. They'd been maintained by the ASCS on a county-by-county basis, and Sac County was one of the counties where the field office had kept the enforcement mechanism active. There was an argument that night. It wasn't explosive. It was the kind of argument that runs in low tones for about 40 minutes and ends without resolution, because no one can change what's already been framed and poured and financed. Kevin eventually said, "Okay, what are our options?" That was the right question. There were essentially three. First, they could reduce the herd back to a level consistent with the quota ceiling, effectively pulling back the expansion before it ever reached full production capacity. That would mean the $62,000 extension was financing infrastructure they couldn't fully use, and the fixed overhead benefit Kevin had calculated for the expansion evaporated. Second, they could apply to the ASCS for a quota modification, a formal process that allowed producers to petition for a baseline adjustment based on documented operational changes. This was time-consuming, not guaranteed, and still left them exposed for any overage produced while the application was pending. Third, they could contest the quota certificate itself, argue that the baseline calculation from 1975 to 1977 was inaccurate, that the 3-year average understated actual historical production, and that the authorized ceiling should be higher. Option 3 was a long shot, but Dale remembered something that Kevin and Gary didn't know. During 1974, before the certificate baseline period began, the operation had run a much larger herd. He'd borrowed to expand in 1973, hit capacity problems in the barn that existed at the time, and had sold down to the 240 sow operation before the 1975 baseline year started. If they could document 1974 production, they might be able to argue that the 1975 to 1977 baseline period captured a trough in the operation's output, not its true capacity level. The ASCS grandfather clause provisions, specifically the language in 7 CFR Part 1413, as it existed in the early 1980s, included a provision allowing for exceptional production period adjustments when a producer could demonstrate that the baseline calculation period coincided with documented operational disruption. The question was whether they could prove 1974. Dale went to the cabinet where he kept everything. He kept everything: sales receipts going back to 1969, veterinary invoices, feed delivery records from the co-op, USDA Form 77 livestock inventory reports from every year the program required them. He found the 1974 documents in a cardboard box behind the 1979 tax returns. He found sales receipts from the Sioux City terminal showing deliveries of market hogs that, when tallied, implied a production output considerably higher than the 1975 to 1977 average. He found the feed co-op records showing corn and soybean meal deliveries through 1974 that were inconsistent with the smaller herd size reflected in the baseline period. They hired an agricultural consultant out of Ames, a man named Harold Voss, who had spent 10 years at the Iowa State Extension Office before going private. Voss reviewed the records and gave them a written analysis. His conclusion, based on documented feed inputs and market receipts, the 1974 production year reflected a hundredweight output of approximately 48,000, materially higher than the baseline average. The disruption argument was supportable if the ASCS field office was willing to apply the exceptional period provision. The ASCS meeting was in September. Kevin and Gary drove to the Des Moines field office with Dale and Harold Voss. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The ASCS program director was a career civil servant, not hostile, not sympathetic, just procedural. He worked through the documentation methodically. He acknowledged the exceptional period provision existed. He said the 1974 records were incomplete by his standard. There was no formal USDA livestock census form from that year matching the implied production level because the census form requirement hadn't applied to operations below a certain threshold in 1974. And the Mercer operation had been just under that threshold. The sales receipts and feed records were secondary documentation. The question was whether secondary documentation met the evidentiary standard under the program rules. The director recessed the meeting for 2 weeks to consult with the regional counsel's office. Phil Draper at First National had heard about the USDA review by then. In a rural county in 1984, news moved quickly, especially news that intersected with farm credit. Draper called Kevin in late September and asked for an update. Kevin gave him one. Draper was measured about it. He didn't threaten to call the note, but he did say that if the penalty exposure was confirmed at the full overage rate, the bank's risk assessment on the operating line would need to be reconsidered. The operating line was up for annual renewal in November. That was now 6 weeks away. Kevin ran the numbers again, this time from the other direction. If the quota couldn't be adjusted, and if they produced at full barn capacity for a full year, the penalty exposure was approximately $9,750 at the current assessed rate. The net operating loss from the expansion, expanded fixed costs, increased feed spend, higher debt service, relative to the expected revenue at current market prices, was also negative. The expansion had not improved their position. It had worsened it and added a regulatory liability on top of the underlying market problem. This is the part that doesn't get explained enough about the 1984 farm crisis. The instinct to expand during a price collapse is not irrational. When you're losing money per unit, increasing units looks like the path to covering fixed overhead and reaching a margin threshold. It's a real argument. But it only works if the revenue per unit is positive, if you're making something, even a small amount, on each hog. If you're losing on each hog, producing more hogs accelerates the loss. And if there's a regulatory ceiling above which each additional hundredweight carries a penalty, the math turns from negative to significantly worse. Volume doesn't fix a broken market, it just makes the accounting louder. The ASCS came back in mid-October. The regional council's position was a partial concession. They would accept the secondary documentation as sufficient to support an exceptional period adjustment, but they would apply a conservative methodology to the 1974 calculation, effectively crediting only the sales receipts, not the implied production from feed inputs, on the grounds that feed conversion efficiency could not be assumed. The adjusted baseline came out at 45,000 hundredweight, not the 48,000 Voss had argued for, but 3,000 higher than the original 42,000. 3,000 hundredweight of additional authorized production. At the current live hog price of approximately $44 per hundredweight, that was around $132,000 in authorized revenue headroom per year before penalty assessment began. The new ceiling was 45,000 hundredweight. With the expanded barn at full capacity, they were still projected at 55,000. Still 10,000 hundredweight over. The penalty exposure had narrowed from roughly $9,750 to approximately $7,500, but it hadn't disappeared. They made the decision to reduce the herd. Not eliminate the expansion, but operate the new capacity at a reduced stocking density, roughly 280 sows instead of 340. That brought projected production to approximately 46 to 47,000 hundredweight in a normal year. Some years they'd be under the ceiling, some years marginally over and exposed to a modest per hundredweight assessment on a small overage. It wasn't clean, but it was manageable. The bank renewed the operating line in November. Draper flagged the quota situation in the risk file, rated the credit a notch below where it had been before, and set a covenant requiring a quarterly production report. The operating line came in $5,000 lower than the prior year. Kevin had to carry more expense on the farm credit card to cover the gap in early winter, which cost him higher interest than the operating line rate. These are the small real ways that regulatory and financial pressure compounds on a farm operation, not in dramatic moments, but in incremental tightening. By the end of 1984, the Mercer operation had survived the year, but not without cost. The expansion had added approximately $62,000 in debt. The partial quota adjustment had limited the penalty exposure to manageable levels. The herd reduction had sacrificed some of the overhead efficiency Kevin had projected. The net result was an operation that was roughly the same size as before the expansion in terms of effective output, but carrying significantly more debt and operating at a tighter regulatory margin. Dale didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say much about it at all once the ASCS meetings were done. He went back to the records cabinet and organized the 1984 files with the same methodical attention he'd given every year before. He filed the quota adjustment letter from the ASCS next to the original 1978 certificate. He labeled the folder clearly, in marker, so that it would be visible to anyone who opened the cabinet. Kevin looked at the final numbers in December and arrived at a conclusion that he stated plainly to Gary one afternoon while they were doing inventory. He said, "We spent $62,000 and 8 months to end up with less flexibility than we had at the start of the year." Gary said, "Would you have done it differently?" Kevin thought about that for a moment. He said, "I'd have asked more questions first." That's the honest answer, and it's also the answer that the farm crisis required of everyone who went through it. The crisis wasn't created by bad farmers or reckless decisions in isolation. It was created by a systemic pattern. Prices collapse. Producers attempt to compensate through volume. Volume increases national supply. Supply keeps prices low, and the producers who borrowed to expand are worse off than before. Federal production controls were an attempt to interrupt that cycle, an attempt that was administratively uneven, inconsistently communicated to producers, and frequently misunderstood, even by the farmers. It was meant to protect or constrain. The quota certificate Dale had filed in 1978 was both a protection and a constraint, and it had functioned quietly for 6 years without anyone on the operation fully understanding what it said. That's not unusual. Agricultural regulatory filings accumulate over the life of a farm. They reflect the programs and incentives of the year they were created. They don't automatically update when the operation changes. They sit in folders in cabinets, and they wait. The barn addition stood. It was never operated at full capacity in the manner Kevin had originally projected. By 1986, when hog prices began a slow recovery, the Mercer operation was running the expanded facility at the adjusted stocking level and had paid down a portion of the note extension. They did not expand again. They built more stalls. The ceiling never moved. If you find value in stories like this one, real accounts of how farm families navigated the hardest years of the American agricultural economy, consider subscribing. There are more of these stories, and they're worth understanding.